So, could you give me 5 years of paying for cover crops, and then we can transition off of it. As farmers here in Iowa, we have put about 3% of the row crops as cover crops, which is the only way to stop the soil erosion and raise the water quality. And with farm prices so low, farmers cannot take on that task of doing it all. That's why it's sitting at 3%. That's all that's been covered in the state.
Right. I mean, we're asking farmers to be on the forefront of conservation and environmental quality and climate change, but we haven't, as a country, been willing to put our money where our mouth is. I mean, the way I see it, if they got the MFP put together to make up for a trade war that never should have happened, and doesn't even make most folks whole, if we can find billions of dollars to pay farmers to not be selling their products to China, surely we can find the money to invest in things like cover crops and pioneering new methods of soil management and other things to support that. So we'll do the math with you too. And I know as I talk to farmers, I'm finding out the extent to which farmers right now are doing math for a living and living with the uncertainty of figuring out, I mean, you got enough uncertainty to begin with what's happening with the climate and what's happening with consolidation. And now we got it added in with trade, and in the meantime, we're asking you to do things like the cover crops without the kind of support to make it possible or to make it pencil out. We should never ask farmers to do something that can't pencil out. It's not fair, and it's defying common sense. We will find a way to support that.
Are concerned about the Middle East. The debate last night started on that, but did not get to issues that we feel are at the base of it, and that is the broken Camp David Accords and the particularly one-sided U.S. policy at the present time in favor of Israel and against Palestine. What will you do to restart the American policy down a productive path where Israel, but particularly our suffering Palestinian brothers and sisters, are concerned?
So we will not know peace and stability in the Middle East until Palestinians and Israelis can live in peace and prosperity. And what we're seeing right now is very little evidence of any commitment to that in this White House. Worse, we're seeing a White House that seems to view it as fair game to mix domestic political purposes with foreign policy. Including things like taking actions, for example, the recognition of the Golan Heights, basically designed to have an influence in the domestic politics of Israel, where our goal has to be peace, and our fidelity to the alliance doesn't mean aligning with any particular political party there. So we've got to ask whether or not the United States is prepared to act as a good friend and as an honest broker. And that will be the focus, the North Star of our policy. Moving toward peace, because the reality is if we don't develop a solution, a two-state solution, then we will see Israel unable to be both a Jewish state and a democracy. Would have to choose. That's not good for anybody. That's not good for Israelis, it's not good for Palestinians, and it is not good for the United States or for stability in the region. We have got to act and guide our ally and engage the international community. And frankly, there are a lot of countries who have had a hand, for example, in the immiseration of the people of Gaza. We have to make sure that we are more than doing our part because we have been so involved, and fix our view on the aspirations, the legitimate aspirations of all of the people in the region toward peace and prosperity. So everybody's arguing about coverage, right? And it's important. I mean, I think it's real important too. But what good is it to have coverage on paper if you can't get seen? And we are seeing this get worse, not better, especially in rural areas. With hospitals closing, we just turned through Marshalltown on the way over here. They lost their birthing center not long ago. And that's just for regular physical medical conditions. If you need support for addiction or mental health services, which are hitting rural areas especially hard, it's even harder to get seen. And we've got to recognize that, yeah, the coverage part's important, but we got to make sure we have more providers. It's one of the reasons why my national service program calls for a community health corps, to get more people interested in a career in care. It's why we got to put our money where our mouth is. Once again, this time when it comes to the way we reimburse and show that the federal policy sees the difference and why it's so important to have people in rural areas. When there's a debate about college student loan forgiveness, part of what I want to do is, for the purpose of loan forgiveness, count being a rural medical provider as public service. Because it is. We got consolidation of for-profit hospital chains and clinics that's driving the costs and the prices up and leading to some of the problems you're talking about. That requires serious attention. So all of these issues have to be talked about too. And they're not getting as much oxygen, I think, because there's this exciting political fight over coverage. But coverage is the beginning, not the end of solving those issues. And I will work every day to make sure that we grow, not reduce, the level of service that is available and the number of places to go to in rural areas. Otherwise, no matter how many jobs we create, it's going to be harder and harder for people to choose to continue to live in the communities where they grew up. So thanks for giving that a voice.
Addiction, poverty, mental illness, and employment issues have brought homelessness in America to a crisis level. Do you have a plan to provide resources to help people transition from homelessness in impactful, humanizing, and dignifying ways? Also, considering your emphasis on America's crisis of belonging, do you have a plan to help refugees integrate into our society?
Two great questions. So when it comes to homelessness, we have such a long way to go as a country. And the reality is people are unhoused, whether you're in some of the most expensive places to get real estate. We just visited a bridge facility for people living in homelessness in Watts, neighborhood of Los Angeles. Or areas like here in the Midwest, where folks in some of those big cities don't understand how we could possibly have a homelessness problem, because a house around here, or where I live, costs the same as a parking space out there, but we still do. Because it's a question of how much housing there is, but not only how much housing. So yes, we got to build more affordable housing, first of all. And my plan will give 7 million more Americans access to affordable housing. We've got to be willing to support, in particular, families with kids and make sure there's no longer a waiting list to get these kinds of federal supports and vouchers. But then you got folks who are also often unable to avail themselves of the supports we do have because of a challenge with mental health or a challenge with addiction. We lost a life in our city to hypothermia from somebody who was offered shelter. I myself, the day before that polar vortex we had last year, saw a guy outside clearly needed to be inside. And I stepped out of the car to talk to him, tried to give him a ride, and talk him into coming with me. And he wanted to pray with me, which we did, but I couldn't get him indoors. As far as I know, he made it somehow, because I didn't hear bad news on his account. But we know that happens a lot too. And that's the power of permanent supportive housing. It's what we're doing at home in our city, and it's what we've got to do around the country. It's not saying you got to fix all your problems before we can ever get you indoors. It's recognizing that if we can just get somebody indoors, even for a minute, then we have a better chance of being able to address whatever mental health or addiction challenges they have. Sometimes somebody refuses to come inside because they're in a relationship, and we haven't been able to provide the supports for a couple to be seen. One of the things they were doing in Watts that was so intelligent was they just made it possible to take care of pets, because sometimes for someone experiencing homelessness, that's all they've got. And it might not seem rational to us, but you would not come in from the cold if it meant being separated from your family. I think it actually would seem rational to a lot of us. And so we've got to act across the spectrum, whether it's housing itself, income, physical health support, mental health, and recognizing that in order to get somebody into permanent supportive housing, there's that transition period where you got to look after them too, whether it's out on the street or hopefully in some kind of gateway facility. We will supercharge the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which helped us get close to functional zero on veterans homelessness in our city, and use it as a resource to deal with the different kinds of housing and homelessness issues that different communities face. Now, when it comes to refugees, this again is something that it shocks me that some of the same politicians who would cloak themselves in Christianity would support things like what they were doing in Texas, where they said they're not going to take refugees at all. And let's be very clear. Taking in refugees is not just doing somebody a favor. In our city and across America, often some of those who have the most to contribute are refugees. Sometimes we're talking about people who have unbelievable skill, but they're fleeing violence and unable to prosper at home. So this is something where we as a country benefit, as well as, I think, a moral obligation. And in the grand scheme of things, the numbers, even when they were higher under the Obama administration, the numbers of refugees we admitted were tiny relative to the US population. It's why those numbers should be a floor, not a ceiling. We will act to make sure the US is doing its part and engage our international partners, because the number of people displaced by climate change and by civil conflict, that's only going to increase in the years ahead. And no one country can work it out on its own. That's one of many, many reasons why we need to restore the credibility of the United States and work with partners around the world to come up with a coordinated plan that looks out to the long term. I do think we need to open that back up because, as you say, it changes the way that lenders interact with students. Now, it's not all there is to it. I also think we got to fix that. You know, we have this whole setup for income-based debt repayment, but it's not exactly user-friendly, right? We have a lot of data that the IRS already has, and the Department of Education. They don't talk to each other. The systems don't talk to each other enough. And it makes it harder. There are mistakes, there's confusion, and people are put at a disadvantage. So I don't think we have to go declare Jubilee, no debt for anybody, and you're lucky if you happen to have debt on the day we declared it, and if you didn't, too bad, right? I think we can do this in a more responsible way. But we do have to change the balance of power. And that's what I think your question gets to, and that's where we have to go. Thanks. Front and center.
All right, hello. I'm Luis, I'm 16, and I'm a student here at Tama. My question, well, I guess I should start off with, immigration is really important to me, and my question is, how do you propose on fixing a broken immigration system in a country that was built from immigration?
Yeah. First of all, you're right. Where would our country be if it weren't for immigration? Other than the First Nations who were here all along and those who were brought here in chains. Everyone else came here by way of immigration. I'm here by way of immigration. My father came to this country because it was the best place to get an education, and then he became a citizen. And my city, which lost thousands of people after the factories closed, is now growing. It's taken decades of work by my predecessors and a huge effort while I was mayor to get our city growing again. And the truth is, if you look at the numbers, if you cut out immigration, we'd still be a shrinking city. So it's also part of what's bringing a lot of our communities back to life. A lot of rural communities that worked so hard to figure out how to grow jobs and are now worried about how to grow population in order to keep up. And if we begin with that attitude, we realize that this isn't about doing anybody a favor. This is about making sure our country and our communities are strong. What does that actually look like? Well, first of all, we got to change the way we handle the border. Family separation doesn't make this country safer. What it does is it undermines the moral authority of our nation, and it hurts so many very real people. The treatment of children at the border is a moral emergency in the United States, and it does nothing to make America safer. These are things we can act on right away, and I will. Then we got to go to the bigger lift, which is to fix U.S. immigration law. It hasn't changed since long before you were born, the mid-1980s. And it shouldn't take that long to fix these things. More than that, some of the levels, the country caps, and the way they set work-based immigration and family reunification, it's actually set in law, so you can't change it without going back to Congress, which you only get to do once in a generation. So what we're going to do is we're going to make the system more flexible. When we set up a new law that creates a pathway to citizenship, for example, for undocumented residents, that makes sure that dreamers are at the front of the line and protected in the meantime. We're also going to make sure that there's a more flexible system for visas in the future, so that when the economy needs more people, there's a way to make sure that more people are authorized to come in. Remember, 11 million undocumented people living in this country means our economy needed 11 more million people than we had. And we got them, but they're in the shadows, unprotected, often living with the threat of deportation hanging over their heads, stressing out their families, and preventing them from contributing as well as reaping the benefits of citizenship. When we fix that, we'll also make sure that there's a flexible system so every couple years we can review the numbers and make sure we true them up toward what makes sense instead of having to go back to Congress all the time. Because if there's one thing we know about Congress, it's that you don't want to put a big reform through Congress any more often than you have to, because they might come in a few years or decades late. So we're going to act on that, create that flexibility, and above all, just send that message that we welcome immigration because immigration is what's made this country what it is.
Can you do something about that?
And this will be the last question.
All right. I promised you, so I'll be real quick and then I'll come to you. Yeah, so look, they keep saying there's no way to keep Social Security intact, right? We have no choice, we're gonna have to cut benefits. It's not true. We can make sure the Social Security Fund is in great shape. At least, I have a selfish interest in making sure it's at least good into the 2050s, because that's when I plan to be drawing. And we can do that, as long as we're willing to raise the cap. If you're making more than $250,000, I think that ought to contribute to Social Security too. You'll be fine, but we need that to shore up Social Security. All right, you get the last word.
I am one of the people who think that a wall won't stop all the illegal drugs that are flowing into the country right now, since I think that most of the drugs that are coming in illegally are coming in through points of entry in the border. How will you approach like all of the drugs that are coming in and all the cash that is going out and all the weapons that are going out illegally back and forth between Mexico and the United States?
Yeah, you're right, a wall isn't going to do the trick.
Yeah.
In fact, you know, whether we're talking about illegal drugs, or we're talking about weaponry, or whether we're talking about other kinds of threats and things going on in our economy and our security picture, this is increasingly a 21st century set of problems. And the president's imagination is stuck in the 17th century, right? A wall and a moat full of alligators is a 17th century technology.
Yeah.
We've got to think about this differently. Now, some of it is about technology, making sure that we are equipped from a law enforcement perspective to make sure that when it comes to the flows of things like weaponry and drugs, that we have the best means possible for securing our points of entry. A lot of it's also recognizing the demand side. Look, part of what makes the drug trade so profitable is the penalties that are associated with drugs. So in a weird way, we have actually, with the failed war on drugs, helped to create a market that has made trafficking in drugs more lucrative than it otherwise would be, and creating a huge incentive to get involved in it. I saw it working counterterrorism. I specialized in efforts to stop the flow of funding into the insurgency in Afghanistan, working with the DEA. And it's actually not that different over there in a lot of ways. We have to break the value chain that makes this such a profitable trade. And part of that means moving on from the failed strategy of the war on drugs. Part of it's making sure that we're equipped in the right way at the border. And then part of it means making sure, especially when we're talking about US-Mexico flows, that we are the best possible partner to Mexico. This is a problem on both sides of the border. That means governments on both sides of the border should be closely coordinating on what to do about it. We need a prosperous and stable Mexico. The world needs a prosperous and stable Mexico. A lot of the challenges, even in Central America, would be a little bit easier if Mexico itself were more prosperous and more stable. This has to be done in the context of partnership, and there will be a completely new attitude and a much more logical strategy on dealing with these issues when I'm president. So, I know our time's up. I want to thank you again for taking the time to be here. And I imagine if you're here, then you're pretty dialed in. And there must be some sense of hope that propelled you into taking the trouble to be here. because I don't think you get involved even to the point of showing up and watching a candidate talk at you. I don't think you get involved unless you have some level of confidence that it matters who is in office. Some level of hope that if we get the right people in office, the right hands guided by the right values on the pulleys and levers of our government, that our individual everyday lives and our communities are going to get better. And since you have brought that spirit here, I'm now hoping I can look to you to take that spirit out where you go, to find people in your lives who may be this close to switching it off, because it's depressing, right? You watch the news, you look at what's happening on Capitol Hill, it's exhausting. And I think it creates a temptation to just turn it off and walk away. But this is the moment that we get to do the exact opposite, because this is the moment it's actually in our control, especially in your control as Iowans. And so I hope that you will reach out to everybody you know, urge them to be part of the process, hopefully urge them to come caucus for me if you're committed to doing that. And together, I think we can put ourselves in a position to look back with great pride on what we did together in 2020 to make our communities better off. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring so much. And I'll see you as we go on the track. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you like this political content, please consider subscribing.